Beautiful lawns and gardens don't grow naturally. Weeds do. And as much as we may wish it weren't so, to get the results that we want, in addition to planting our seeds, we've got to pull some weeds. Now, when I sent out the email newsletter this week, I wondered if we might attract some stoners here today. You know, dude, let's go down to that Center for Spiritual Living. They're going to talk about weed. Planting seeds and pulling weeds. It's the story of life. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we discussed being careful what we plant. And we used Jesus' parable of the sower to dramatize our lives. That is, we're all individual gardens in which either weeds of lack and despair proliferate, or plants that blossom and have fruit of joy and everything that's good that we can possibly imagine. And the soil, the receptive medium, our hearts and our minds, is the most valuable acreage on planet Earth. It's from this chunk of living terra firma that we plant good seeds, uproot weeds, grow and harvest the fruits of our labors. And when we're passionate about something or have a love for something, we need to plant it, nurture it, water it, and with enough loving care, we will reap a bountiful harvest. So, what is standing between us and the life of our dreams? Most often it's the weeds in our garden. Weeds are the negative thoughts, doubts, fears of failure, and so many other things that have sprung up in our garden. We need to do some weeding. Because if our negative thoughts remain in place for too long, they can become beliefs. And it takes a lot of effort to pull them out by the roots. In his parable, Jesus warned about the choking influence of weeds and thorns, pesky, prickly weeds that squeeze the life out of the seedlings we're trying to grow. And the first weeds that Jesus warned about are what he called the worries of the world, the anxieties of the age. Now, in the original language, Aramaic, which Jesus spoke, the words he used for worry or anxiety actually mean to be drawn in different directions or to be distracted. What distracts you? Considering the pace at which life moves these days, all the sights and all the sounds, the sensations that bombard us daily, perhaps a better question might be, what doesn't distract you? What pulls you in directions that you know are unproductive? We could say busyness. Busyness, a full schedule of things, good and some not so good, that crowd out our best intentions, like spending quiet time in the morning in prayer and meditation, or regular exercise, or quality time spent with our family and friends. Some people are distracted and worried about what others think about them, preoccupied with pleasing others and gaining their approval. And still others are pulled by their insecurities, always trying to find something that will make them feel worthy of taking up space on this planet. The scary thing about weeds is their ability to multiply. When I was a little kid, I used to love to break off the stem of a dandelion that had a full head of seeds, a cluster. A puff of breath would launch dozens of tiny angel hair parachutes that can produce thousands of more seeds. Just as every apple seed contains within it the potential of an apple tree that can produce thousands more seeds and more trees and more seeds and on into infinity, just so each one of us can produce yet another seed factory. And it's letting go of what we need to let go of to allow us to pull even one weed, because just one weed freely in your life can limit the growth of what you desire and even ultimately result in a crop failure. I grew up in Indiana which produces about 21% of the popcorn grown in this country. And a friend who has a popcorn farm told me that weeds left unattended can reduce the corn harvest by as much as 40 to 60%. And as I consider the consequences of letting my mental weeds turn into harvest destroyers, I realize that I need to be very diligent about pulling the weeds that interfere with my growth. The reality is that all soil contains weed seeds. Lives do too. I wish there were some sort of cosmic herbicide that would instantly eradicate weeds from our lives. Unfortunately, there isn't. Each one of us has to be on the lookout for the weeds that choke our growth, and once we've identified them, we need to take action to eliminate them. I read about a man who worked for a landscaping company which had a contract to maintain the lawns and gardens of a headquarters of a major corporation. And the people at this company were very image-oriented, and they wanted everything on their property to look picture perfect. So the worker was new to the job, and he thought he knew what to do. Water the flower beds, prune the plants, pull the weeds, no problem at all. But one day, while he was working, the boss came up and told him to pull a weed, pointing to a very pretty flowering plant. A plant that had been planted in other clients' flower beds at quite an expense. So the worker informed the boss that this flower wasn't a weed. However, he soon discovered that by the company's definition, that beautiful plant was indeed a weed. It was a weed, said the boss, because it was growing in a flower bed where it didn't belong, and the client didn't want it there. So the employee pulled this very expensive weed and dumped it into a trash bucket. The moral of the story? Some weeds are very easy to spot. A dandelion or a ragweed, everyone knows these are weeds. Wherever they're grown, they're considered weeds. But even a beautiful, expensive plant is a weed if it's growing in the wrong flower bed. It may not be a bad plant elsewhere, but it's out of place. And if we compare our spiritual lives to the process of growing a garden, then we know that our gardens are never immune to the problem of weeds, whether it be weeds that are easily spotted or whether it's something potentially good which is out of place. We all must deal with those weeds. As our story of the beautiful flower at the corporate headquarters shows, identifying the weeds in our lives can be harder than we think. And even the worst weeds might be helpful in the right time and the right place. I've mentioned dandelions as obvious weeds that we'd want to eliminate, but even they have their benefits. Every spring, my grandmother would go out and pick dandelion greens and cook them for dinner. She loved them. Were they any good? I don't know. They were dark green and they had vinegar on them. 2 no-nos for a little kid. So I never tried them. Back in my cruise ship days, I used to visit Costa Rica fairly often, and one of their big cash crops is cashews. Now, I love cashews especially. I like all kinds of nuts, but cashews are my favorite. So imagine my surprise when I learned that Costa Ricans don't eat cashew nuts. They eat the fruit from which the nut grows. It's eaten fresh, this fruit, and they can make jam or wine or a fruit punch drink, but they throw the nuts away. It turns out that cashews are poisonous. They contain cyanide. They're only safe to eat after they're roasted. Dandelions, cashews, whether they're weeds or not depends on you. In fact, Emerson said, a weed is a plant whose virtues have not yet been discovered. There are weeds in our lives that we can't eliminate. There may be people who are negative influences, and we could call them weeds in our social garden, but we can't get rid of them. The law permits herbicide, but takes a dim view of homicide. So let's focus on the weeds we can do something about. The weeds choking our spiritual, mental, and emotional gardens. Is there a neglected corner of your inner garden that's overgrown? What kinds of weeds are preventing your highest and best from flourishing? Growing up in Indiana, we had a type of weed that was known as a stinkweed for obvious reasons. Stinkweeds are nasty, noxious things, but they're not nearly as harmful as thinkweeds. Thinkweeds lead to misery, poverty, sickness, and even death. And there are many types of thinkweeds. Depression is an unusually ugly and stubborn thinkweed, and I have experience with this one. Debilitating, immobilizing depression. It turns out that depression is largely a product of the imagination, but it produces very real, very destructive results. Depression takes over our creative imagination and convinces us that everything is hopeless. Elizabeth Wurtzel puts it this way: that's the thing about depression. A human being can survive almost anything as long as she sees an end in sight. But depression is so insidious and it compounds daily that it's impossible to ever see the end. Well, people tend to deal with this in all kinds of ways: drugs, alcohol, doctors, promiscuity, and all these things are looking for the cure in some outside person or thing. But as bad as it is, the cure for depression is to decide to stop thinking depressed thoughts. Now, you may think it can't possibly be that simple, but it is. It's not easy, but it's simple. Extensive scientific studies show that antidepressant drugs work mostly because of the placebo effect. The real cure is to stop thinking depressing thoughts. And unlike taking drugs, the decision to stop thinking negative thoughts has absolutely no harmful side effects. So, if we're causing depression by thinking depressing thoughts, why don't we just stop it? Well, a bad habit is hard to break. And we may have thought negatively for so long that we began to think that it's realistic and correct and normal. We may find that our depressed state rewards us by providing an excuse for not doing whatever we need to do. We may also find that our depressed state gains us sympathy. The psychologist and tough love expert Albert Ellis said, "You largely constructed your own depression. It wasn't given to you. Therefore, you can deconstruct it." And Ernest Holmes gave us a wonderful affirmative prayer treatment for pulling depression out by the roots. And it contains these thoughts: the depression, the misunderstanding, the maladjustment, the frustration, which may have taken place in my life, is now eradicated. God is the one causation back of all manifestation. Therefore, there cannot remain anything within which does not express perfection. And if you can say that and believe it, you are free. Curing depression is as simple as pulling weeds. We have to pull up each negative thought by the roots and allow the weed to wither in the light of truth. And yet, we often can't motivate ourselves to pull the weeds, which leads us to another thinkweed: procrastination. Several weeks ago, we spent a lot of time on this, so this will just be a quick recap. If you need to pull weeds, but you keep putting it off, you're procrastinating. This is an especially nasty thinkweed because the problem we need to solve gets bigger every time we look at it. And eventually the problem gets so big it's overwhelming. So we need to keep in mind that the younger the weed, the easier it is to pull. And when we procrastinate, we're telling ourselves one or more of these 5 lies. 1, we overestimate the time we have left to get something done. 2, we underestimate how long it will take to complete a task. 3, we overestimate how motivated we'll feel the next day, the next week, the next month, or whenever we're putting that thing off to. 4, we mistakenly think that succeeding at a task requires us to feel like doing it. And 5, we mistakenly think that working when not in the mood is a waste of time. And procrastinators also actively seek out distractions. And the internet is the greatest thing ever invented for those of us who like to put things off till later. For all the vast potential of the internet, it's mostly used to kill time. And it's been said that killing time is not a simple crime. It's murder. So if you want to get yourself to do something, here's an idea. Make the alternative to that task to do nothing. Now, this rule was created by the novelist and screenwriter Raymond Chandler, and he set aside 4 hours every day just for writing. He didn't force himself to actually write, but during those 4 hours, he didn't allow himself to do anything else. He wouldn't let himself read, write letters, or make phone calls. It was either write or do nothing. So he summed up the system. 2 very simple rules. A, you don't have to write, and B, you can't do anything else. Now, I've experimented with this, and I discovered that when I force myself to do absolutely nothing instead of doing what I need to be doing, I quickly get so bored that the alternative to doing nothing suddenly becomes a lot more appealing. How about you? Do you find yourself procrastinating by cleaning, organizing, answering emails, cruising the internet, making plans, and the like? Well, the solution, according to Napoleon Hill, is do it now. The solution, according to Nike, is just do it. The solution, according to Ernest Holmes, is ultimate right action is now. If a gardener holds his seed in his hand and says, tomorrow I am going to plant this seed, his garden will never start growing. Another horrible thinkweed is resentment. It can literally kill you. It's a very poisonous thinkweed. In the Science of Mind textbook, Ernest Holmes wrote about things that cause sickness and even death. And he said people have died of deep and continued resentment. An unhealthful and morbid mental state projects itself into the physical body. So why do we hang on to this kind of stuff instead of pulling it up by the roots and releasing it? Well, it may make us feel virtuous. It may be an attempt at mental revenge. It may be a mechanism for protecting ourselves against getting hurt again. Whatever it is, it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. Doesn't make us feel better, doesn't make the other person feel bad, it doesn't protect us from anything in the future. All it does is grow. And like all weeds, it chokes out the good things that are trying to flourish within us. Another thinkweed, fear. We all experience fear, and once in a while it's even a good thing. Being afraid to drive in the midst of a hurricane is good. Overcoming the fear of driving in a hurricane is almost certainly bad. But mostly, being afraid is not a good thing. It's mostly irrational, based on totally imaginary scenarios that we've built up over time. Stuff like, what if I speak up during the meeting and people laugh at me? Well, you could try reframing that question. What if I don't speak up and then spend the rest of the week kicking myself for being a wuss? Sometimes our fear is based on silly things that our parents or teachers told us when we were too young to know any better. There comes a time when we've got to leave the things of our childhood behind. After all, we got over Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, and the Tooth Fairy, and we manage to survive somehow. The weeds of fear are especially pernicious, but we can take action to uproot them. Writing in the textbook, Ernest tells us, any kind of fear thought retards the free action of life forces. In such cases, a treatment for complete relaxation should be given. Complete relaxation. If you've attended here for any length of time, chances are you've heard me say that it's impossible to experience a negative emotion when you're fully relaxed. And a great deal of the joy and benefit of a meditation is to promote relaxation. Only when you're fully relaxed are you protected from the harmful effects of negative emotions, because the minute you tense up, you're blocking the flow of good in your life. And when negative emotions hit, we may try to suppress them. We know that the way to deal with these thinkweeds is to confront them. But if we try to ignore them or suppress them, we're exacerbating the problem. When we try to bury negative emotions, we're pushing the roots deeper and deeper and deeper. We need to pull some weeds. Weeds tangle the roots of good plants and impede their growth. And a negative thought, person, or situation can overtake your life if you let it. And all too quickly, it can become an obsession. An obsession which prevents you from thinking about that which is good, beautiful, joyous, peaceful, and loving. And when the meadows of your mind are choked with thinkweeds, it makes it really hard to cultivate the good in your life. Weeds rob the soil of nutrients. Weeds produce no fruit, but plenty of seeds. Thinkweeds are incredibly good at growing. They grow like weeds. And they're especially good at producing seeds. And these seeds can take root in our mental gardens, and they can take root in other people's mental gardens as well. So we must be careful not only about what we're planting in our own minds, but what we might be planting in someone else's mind. Now, we can't pull the weeds from someone else's mental garden. We can encourage them to pull their own weeds, but mostly what we need to do is make sure that any seeds of negativity don't travel from us to them or from them to us. Weeding is an ongoing job if you want to enjoy fruitfulness in this life. Neglect the weeds and you'll be overrun, overwhelmed, and be tempted to just give up. And if you give up, the joy of the harvest will be stolen. So what's it going to be? Is there a part of your inner garden that needs some attention? Is your harvest being stolen because you've been neglecting your weeding? Are you ready to roll up your sleeves and start uprooting the weeds of your mental garden? Pulling weeds is not always easy. There's an old gardening joke. When weeding, the best way to make sure you're removing a weed and not a valuable plant is to pull on it. If it comes out of the ground easily, it's a valuable plant. If you've ever tended a physical garden, you know that no matter how many weeds you pull, they tend to come back. They even come back next year and the year after that. And some issues in our lives do the same thing. We work on them and think we have the problem whipped, but they sprout up again at some time in the future. So the question is there a way to ensure that our issues don't come back after we think we've resolved them? Or do we have to resign ourselves to dealing with them over and over again, season after season? Well, I think that we can resolve many of our issues well enough that for the most part, they won't grow back. Maybe we've worked on them hard enough that we managed to get out every little bit of the root. But other issues may be harder to eradicate. Just when you think you're done, you find a little sprout shooting up, And you have to realize that it's there and take steps, once again, to deal with it. Yes, it takes effort to eliminate thinkweeds. That's why you'll find large sections in any bookstore devoted to positive thinking. Positive thinking requires work. You'll not find any books on how to think negatively. That's as easy as falling off a log backwards. Weeds will grow anywhere, in exhausted soil, under very poor conditions. And if you don't work the gardens of your mind, you'll end up mostly with weeds. And if you don't decide what to grow, you'll end up mostly with weeds. Negative thoughts can grow anywhere. They don't need any special care. They thrive on bad conditions. The gardening writer Diane Benson says, speaking of weeds, they know. They just know where to grow, how to dupe you, and how to camouflage themselves among the perfectly respectable plants. They just know. So I've concluded that weeds must have brains. Well, of course, weeds don't really have brains, but they can hijack our brains. And the good news is, we created them, so we can get rid of them. And over time, the number of weeds we have to pull gets smaller and smaller. But the garden of our lives, like any garden, will probably always have at least a few weeds that sprout up and require our attention. Weeds choke out the good things that are trying their best to grow in our lives. And good things are always trying to grow. So the least we can do is help them out by pulling some weeds. And when we weed out the negative influences, we allow the positives to blossom, expand, and thrive. Your mind is a garden. Your thoughts are the seeds, and the harvest can be either flowers or weeds. And so it is.